learners, I welcome you all for the course Ethics, Theories and Application, and the topic of the course is Human Rights Part 2. My name is Shruti Sharma and I am an assistant professor at Delhi University. A critical look at some specific human rights. It is necessary for us to take a closer look at certain basic human rights that touch upon issues that are very much in the news or part and parcel of our everyday experience. Let us critically assess their meaning and foundation. The right to private property, even of producer goods, is a natural human right. But it should not be forgotten that the free gifts of nature also have a social function. This is because this right is rooted in our very human nature as well as in the very makeup of the commodities concerned. Private property, we must understand, is an inalienable human right because inasmuch as we are embodied beings, we need a certain supply of material goods to provide for our growth, health and well-being as well as that of our family members. This would include a reasonable right to store up for future plans and emergencies. By that same token, we also have a right to a reasonable amount of entertainment, rest and leisure for the purpose of recreation after hard work. This calls for repletion of ourselves, our energies and strength so as to be able to work more efficiently and productively in the future. Now, as scientific progress is made and lifestyles change, we may make legitimate demands for more sophisticated forms of amusement as well as more efficient labor-saving devices. All this is quite well ordered and constitutes part of human duty towards human inherent embodied nature. On the other hand, the very nature of material goods require for some free and intelligent beings to take possession of them, take care of them and help them develop more freely and fully. About the only things that we need and that we can find ready-made in the pure state of nature are fruits, vegetables, air and water. For the rest, we need to plow, water, harvest, to weave and tailor, to graze and so on before we can avail for ourselves these consumer goods. A measure of research and development must also be undertaken to improve the quality and quantity of these necessities. They won't simply develop themselves, collaborate and make scientific breakthroughs by natural selection and similar processes. Yet, the very nature of material things themselves require that some free and intelligent agents help them to develop and flourish. It is believed that collective farms and state ownership of industries can assure us of all these. There is no absolute need for private ownership, especially of producer goods. Very true, but history and very recent human experience gives us cause to hesitate. Recent facts have shown that humans do not take care of or manage efficiently that which does not directly belong to them. The former Soviet Union and Communist China before the opening up are the prominent examples. In India too, we repeatedly clamor for bringing back into the public sector many state-run industries, for instance, electric supply. to rescue them from the morass of inefficiency and substandard quality in which they have become mired. It would seem that such enterprises thrive best when they are privately owned and directed, when they can face the challenge of competition by developing quality control, efficiency in management, research into better methods of production, and so on. Admittedly, all this is motivated not so much by the desire to provide better goods and services, but to ensure bigger profits. However, good business acumen recognizes that the two are inseparably connected. It would seem that a blanket ban on all private ownership of producer goods and to advocate only state ownership in this regard would be as disastrous as the reverse. Nor is this the conclusion of those who indulge in armchair philosophizing. Rather, it is borne out by those who have a nose for the facts, especially good business sense. An important consideration that requires reflection is an undeniable element of human experience that tends to go overboard with the burgeoning consumer mentality that suffocates and stifles us. Consumerism, as heralded by globalization, assures us that having more, producing more, hoarding more is the answer to the deep-seated human quest for happiness. Happiness is measured as having more power and things. Thus, the teleology of human life and development is not to be more human, but to have more. Hence, Ayn Rand sees sharing as an anti-value, and all appeals to rights and duties, to love and concern for the poor as merely subjective, foolish preying upon the heart and trying to make a whim into a universal norm. If having more is to be the ultimate goal of human life, it would make absolutely no sense to share, for that would involve having less. But what if the authentic goal of human life was to be more and having more, a mere means to this? Wouldn't that change the whole perspective? Sometimes we would be more by having less, that is, sharing, thus enhancing our social being as a reasonable respite from the wanton and unceasing rape of nature, bequeathing insoluble problems for future generations? And wouldn't this not only dehumanize millions yet unborn, but our very selves too? For it is harming society and nature, both of which are necessary for our growth. Now, this calls for some serious deliberation on the teleology of human life. Now, let us understand what is the right to life. This is perhaps the most basic of all fundamental rights, in the sense that if one were to deny it, all the others would have no meaning. Aquinas included it among the most basic practical first principles with which human beings are endowed. Indeed, as the natural urge for self-preservation, it is one of those metaphysical drives which we share with all beings. It is considered as sacred, and no one, for any purpose whatsoever, can therefore arrogate to himself or herself the right to directly destroy an innocent human being. Even an atheist would have good reasons to respect this right, for it is the basis of all the others, and without it the rest would become derisory. However, this does not mean that one cannot strike back, even kill an unjust aggressor. The legitimate defense of individual persons as well as of societies would allow one the right to do so. St. Thomas Aquinas justifies this on the grounds of the principle of double effect in his book Summa Theologia. He says the act of self-defense can have a double effect: the preservation of one's own life and the killing of the aggressor. The one is intended and the other is not. St. Thomas Aquinas reiterates, if a human person in self-defense uses more than necessary violence, it will be unlawful. Whereas, if he repels force with moderation, his defense will be lawful. Nor is it necessary for salvation that a man omit the act of moderation, self-defense, to avoid killing the other man, since one is bound to take more care of one's own life than that of others. Helder Camara teaches us in his Spiral of Violence to be wary of the definitely biased understanding of the term that vested interest and the powers project. We must recognize three distinct types of violence. First, structural violence. Structural violence is the violence that is constituted by unjust social or other structures. Example, the caste system, various forms of apartheid and discrimination, which effectively debar persons of a particular sex, ethnic origin, etc. from the enjoyment of certain fundamental human rights. Second, insurrectional violence. This occurs when oppressed people, unable to bear the injustice let loose on them by the bullying tyrannical powers, that be strike back desperately in writing and other forms of civil unrest. The third form is repressive violence. This takes place when the state calls in crack troops, maybe even helicopter, gunships, to rain down ruthless fire bombs and bullets on the revolting peasantry or slum dwellers, whose makeshift weapons and ragtag army are no match for them. Eventually, this latter form of violence sets up even worse and more inhuman structures to keep the people in control. A time is reached when the latter can take it no more, and the weary round starts all over again. Thus, there is a cycle of continually escalating violence. Helder Camara, the prophetic pastor of Recife, points out only the second instance is qualified as violence. The first and third are described as public order and restoring the public order respectively. This is yet another example of how the dominant class rules over every aspect of life, including deciding how keywords in the vocabulary are to be defined and used invariably in a way that justifies the status quo and those who wield the reins of power in any given society. In today's warped setup, where violence is frequently the first reaction to an unwelcome development, college students, even school kids attacking professors or teachers who didn't give them a good mark, or stabbing former partners who had ditched them. We cannot praise too highly those who call for reconciliation, dialogue and healing. Catholic Church, in its document on the Church in the Modern World, concurs, we cannot fail to praise those who renounce violence in the vindication of their rights, and who resort to methods of defense which are otherwise available to weaker parties too. However, a small provision is added here. Injury to the rights and duties of others or of the community itself is to be avoided. This should not necessarily oblige us to go along with the great votary of Ahimsa, Mahatma Gandhi, when he teaches that every murder or other injury, no matter for what cause, committed against another is a crime against humanity. Paulo Freire would also differ with Mahatma Gandhi on this matter, though not all would approve of his reasoning all the way. The violence of the oppressed is qualitatively different from the violence of the oppressor. Violence of the oppressor is universally dehumanizing. It reduces both its victims as well as its perpetrators, though for different reasons, to a subhuman conditional man. The violence of the oppressor prevents the oppressed from being fully human. Violence of the oppressed prevents the oppressor from dehumanizing himself. The oppressor is almost invariably a male. Inasmuch as the oppressed uses violence because of its desire to pursue the right to be human, and in fighting to be human, takes away the oppressor's power to dominate, it thereby rescues him from the dehumanizing act of degrading both himself and the other. It cannot be put on the same level as oppressive violence. It is to be noted that the real subject of political power is the people who, in effect, delegate some of this power, example, to provide basic necessities, security, and so on, either tacitly or by election, to their representatives and the functionaries they employ for this purpose. Now, if and when these representatives prove themselves unworthy or incapable of fulfilling this commission, the people obviously have the right to depose them and replace them with others whom they find fit. However, when there is a government so entrenched in its power that no legal means can oust it, for instance, the military regime of Myanmar, assuredly the people would have the right to violent revolution to achieve its legitimate aim. St. Thomas Aquinas approves of it and says that when such times of civil revolt, unrest, and dissension arise, it is the tyrant or the tyrannical government that is more guilty of sedition, for it is the real party who fosters discord and dissension among the people in order to lord it over them more securely. Salvino Azzopardi lists 5 conditions under which the scholastic tradition permits an oppressed people to revolt. These are as follows. First, the abuse of power is really excessive and habitual. All peaceful means have been employed in vain, for example, passive resistance, active but no violent protest, etc. Next, no more violence than is necessary is allowed. No harm is done to innocent third parties. Example, there should not be any loss of their lives, their property, etc. And no greater evil is foreseen to ensure. However, with all respect to the scholastic tradition, we may wonder how useful such stipulations can be to would-be revolutionary leaders in a concrete situation. apart from very general guidelines. It requires pondering over some pressing issues. These are: how does one go about trying to fulfill these requirements in a practical way? For instance, how does one restrain the use of violence? How does one determine who is an innocent third party in cases of large-scale structural injustice? And how would one provide practical safeguards against the suffering of the innocent, even if one could identify them? What is the criterion to decide not just that the abuse of power has been excessive and habitual, but that all peaceful means have actually been employed? And suppose one is reasonably certain that the government is a kind of wild repressive steamroller that would show no respect for peaceful protesters. In that case, could one proceed directly to the use of violence? How does one arrive at the assurance that no greater evil would result from the uprising? In most cases, whether the people revolt or not depends upon the magnitude and the degree of the oppression they are facing. Eventually, they are convinced that they cannot take it anymore, that all reasonable bounds have been crossed. They make some desperate resolve to go down fighting rather than die by degrees amidst the humiliation of their women and children. The fact of the matter is that usually the revolters are well aware that they have no chance. They are underfed, untrained, and poorly equipped against a few well-fed, well-trained, and well-armed regulars. This reminds us of Jai Prakash Narayan, the former firebrand revolutionary, who was eventually converted to non-violence. He shared that it was more for pragmatic reasons, that means he had doubt whether it will work or not, than for moral ones that he abandoned the path of popular violence and insurrection. Now let us sum up what we have learned. Human rights are the inalienable rights of all human beings. These rights cannot be revoked except in specific circumstances and in accordance with a specific procedure. Second, the right to liberty, for example, may be limited if a court finds the person guilty of a crime. All human rights are indivisible, whether civil or political, including the right to life, equality before the law, and freedom of expression, economic, social, and cultural rights as the right to work, social security and education, or collective rights as the right to development and self-determination. All these rights are indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent. The improvement of one right facilitates advancement of others. Similarly, deprivation of rights has a negative effect on others. The non-discrimination is a universal principle of international law of human rights. The principle exists in all the major treaties on human rights and serves as a central theme of certain international conventions, such as the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. Thank you, learners. That's all in this session.